What's up, everyone? Tera Roberts here with FantasyPros, bringing you another round of 10 players to cut. As always, be sure to like this video and subscribe to FantasyPros across all platforms. Now let's go ahead and dive right in with players to cut in 12 and 14 team leagues. First up, Calvin Ridley. We all do it from time to time. We hold on to big name players that have been out for a while, hoping that they can come back just at the right moment to be our league winning player. Calvin Ridley is still rostered in 64% of Yahoo leagues and 62.8% of ESPN leagues, so apparently Ridley is that guy for quite a few of you. You were justified in holding on to him for a while since we really had no clarification on if and when he'd be back. But if you're a playoff team still rostering Ridley, at this point we need to be realistic about his situation. Ridley still isn't back at practice and hasn't played a game since October 24th, which was week 7. Even if he walked into practice today and said that he was in a better place right now and ready to contribute for the last 3 games, could he really play this Sunday? Even if he was working out, and even if he was keeping himself in great physical shape, the Falcons just wouldn't want to rush him back. This is a 27-year-old franchise quarterback in the prime of his career. They are going to want to be certain that he is in football shape and that it's not a risk to play him at the end of the season. And realistically, it's just kind of unnecessary to bring him back with the playoffs being too far out of reach. The Falcons are 6-8 and in the 11th spot in the NFC. They are going to need to hop over 4 teams just to qualify for postseason. I mean, technically they're still in it, but it's not going to happen. I can't see them bringing back their franchise receiver with little to no chance of making the playoffs. I think they will call this a lost year for Ridley and hope that he's in a better spot for 2022. Fantasy managers holding on to him, hoping for a late season return, are just wasting a roster spot. Next up, Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton was on my list for cuts in shallow leagues, and he has moved himself up to the big leagues this week. You want to hope that there's some way that he could return to that early season Courtland Sutton, but there's just no reality that he can. Maybe you're encouraged by a matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders. Sutton had 14 targets and 8 receptions on 94 receiving yards with 1 touchdown when he played the Raiders in week 6. That was when the Raiders were playing very well. So fantasy managers in need of a wide receiver could try to chase points when facing the Raiders. But the Raiders are a different team now, and so are the Broncos. That was week 6, a week 6 game without Jerry Jeudy. And since Jerry Jeudy came back in week 8, Sutton has posted 12 receptions on 131 yards with no receiving touchdowns in 7 games. So basically, his production over the course of the season since week 8 is the equivalent of 1 down game for Cooper Kupp. Teddy Bridgewater suffered a nasty concussion last week, which means that Drew Lock is in line for the start this week. I think that it's just a situation that we want to avoid for the remainder of the fantasy playoffs. Next up, David Johnson. There was some hope that with Rex Burkhead dinged up and the Texans facing the Jacksonville Jaguars, that Johnson would have a good game. But Burkhead ended up playing, dominated the carries, and Johnson had 6 carries for 24 yards and 1 target, 1 reception, and 3 yards. He has posted more than 30 rushing yards just once this season, and he has posted more than 30 receiving yards just once as well. When you combine his 417 scrimmage yards with his 1 touchdown, he just doesn't have a path to fantasy relevance. You can cut him with confidence. Next up, Zach Moss. Another week, another plea for you to cut Zach Moss. It's just not happening here with Zach Moss, and it's not going to. The Bills' backfield feels like it has sorted itself out over the last month. Devin Singletary has 51 rushing attempts for 218 yards and 1 rushing touchdown in his last 4 games. He also has 9 targets, 8 receptions, and 51 receiving yards in those games. Meanwhile, Zach Moss has been a healthy scratch in 3 of his last 4 games, and Matt Breida has had 4 carries for 13 yards and 1 target in the passing game since he fumbled against New England in Week 13. Moss is still rostered in 38% of Yahoo leagues and 42% of ESPN leagues. Breida is rostered in 13% of Yahoo leagues and 9.3% of ESPN leagues. It is stunning that Moss is still rostered in more leagues than Breida, when you consider that Breida is the one that actually isn't a healthy scratch. Regardless, Singletary is the only Bills running back worth rostering at this point. Zach Moss should be cut, and you can go grab literally any other handcuff. Next up, Ryan Tannehill. Ryan Tannehill is another repeat offender on the list this week. Let's recap last week. Pittsburgh's defense is technically not bad against the pass, but that might have a little something to do with the fact that you can literally demolish them on the ground. So I didn't really expect much here, but I would certainly want more than completing 23 passes for 153 yards, a stat line that was only mildly saved by a touchdown on the ground. It still doesn't cut it when you could have started even Nick Mullins and been better off. Tannehill hasn't thrown a touchdown in back-to-back games and hasn't topped 200 passing yards for 3 straight weeks. They play on a short week this week against the San Francisco 49ers, so unfortunately, this is a cut that you'll have to make for week 17. But considering how high he's rostered, he was still worth including for your purposes this week. The only hope for him is that A.J. Brown is back, and maybe, just maybe, the combination of Brown and Julio Jones will suddenly rejuvenate this passing game. But I doubt it. So you can go ahead and cut him. Given his fantasy value in recent weeks, he is not going to be a good option in Week 17 against the Miami Dolphins. Next up, Ty Johnson. Running backs are gold, so we tend to hold on to guys who aren't technically usable in the hopes that they can pay off in the event of an injury to a lead back. Ty Johnson has been one of those guys floating off and on fantasy rosters, with the Jets' backfield having multiple injuries this season. But Johnson was a healthy scratch this week with Michael Carter and Tevin Coleman both active and healthy. He might have RB4 value if one of them were to go down. In week 6, he had 6 rushing attempts for 17 yards and 4 receptions for 40 yards. It doesn't really make much sense to hold on to Johnson, though, if he's going to be a healthy scratch. Even if he's active this week, he's likely going to be the 3rd running back option. It's more than okay to let him go. Next up, Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith isn't particularly highly rostered, but just barely enough to qualify for this list. Last week, Hunter Henry scored both touchdowns while Smith had 3 targets, 1 reception, and only 3 yards. He also added 1 rushing attempt for 2 yards. There's just not enough upside here to keep him on your fantasy roster. Hunter Henry did see 8 targets last week, but outside of that, the tight end position in the Patriots offense is really one that relies on touchdown upside. Smith just doesn't have that. There's no value for him as long as Hunter Henry exists. If you're one of the few hanging on to him, let him go. Moving on to players to cut in shallow leagues. And first up, Derek Carr. Derek Carr is such an odd case. He started off the season on fire, 12 touchdowns in his first 7 games, and 5 games over 300 yards, often close to 400. He led the NFL in total passing yards for a large chunk of the season. But because it's Derek Carr, we didn't trust him. And by the time we came around to feeling comfortable with starting him, things started to turn downhill. Carr has only had 1 game with multiple touchdowns since his Week 8 bye, which was a blowout loss to Kansas City back in Week 10. Since the bye, he has topped 300 passing yards just 1 time, which was back in Week 12. And then the Raiders' offense has failed to reach 20 points in their last 3 games. In deeper leagues, Carr may offer some streaming value, but he faces Denver and then the Indianapolis Colts. The Broncos are 4th against fantasy quarterbacks this season, and the Colts are 2nd over the past 5 weeks. I don't see a lot of upside in holding on to a struggling quarterback that has bad matchups, especially in shallow leagues. Next up, Marvin Jones. This was the Jags' first game without Urban Meyer, and while the game did confirm what we already knew, Urban Meyer was a terrible coach, Jacksonville still has one of the worst rosters in the league, and even a coaching change couldn't stop them from losing 30-16 to the Houston Texans. The run game definitely benefited from his lack of weird coaching choices, but the Jags still lost to one of the worst teams in the league at home by 2 touchdowns. Marvin Jones had only 2 receptions for 14 yards on 4 targets. It is the 2nd time in the past 3 weeks that he has been held to less than 15 yards. In deeper leagues, fantasy managers may want to cash in on a matchup against the Jets, but the Jets are actually 9th ranked against fantasy wide receivers this year. Their issue on defense is more so in the run game. In shallow leagues, Jones is just not worthy of a roster right now. And finally, Pat Freiermuth. Let me preface this with saying I love Pat Freiermuth, and I am definitely a Muth truther, but Freiermuth left week 15 with his second recent concussion, and that typically doesn't bode well for his chances of playing next week against the Browns. His targets have also been going down, and he has become touchdown dependent. He hasn't had 5 targets in a game since week 11. In deeper leagues, there aren't enough good fantasy tight ends to go around, so you can justify holding on to him. But in shallow leagues, you can put him on IR if you can. But if you don't have room or the ability to do so, you just need to send him to the waiver wire if he can't clear concussion protocol. And that wraps up this week's Players to Cut. As always, be sure to like this video and subscribe to FantasyPros across all platforms, and come back next week for another round of Players to Cut.